Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody for being here. We are very lucky today to have three truly visionary museum directors. Thelma Golden is the director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is the world's leading institution devoted to visual arts by artists of African descent. She began her career as an intern at the Studio Museum in 1987 before joining the Whitney Museum of American Art the following year. Over the next decade at the Whitney, she staged now legendary exhibitions, including as a member of the curatorial team for the groundbreaking 1993 biennial and the 1994 exhibition, Black Male Representations of Masculinity in American Art. Thelma returned to the Studio Museum as deputy director for exhibitions and programs under the then director, Larry Stokes Sims, in 2000, before becoming director herself in 2005. Under her visionary leadership, the Studio Museum has cemented itself as one of the most serious and meaningful art museums internationally. Its artist residency program has propelled the careers of some of the most significant artists working anywhere today. Meanwhile, every time I interview someone and I'm struck by how original and insightful their thoughts are, no doubt they came through the Studio Museum. The alum network and the supporters network is redefining museum practice. In 2015, Thelma Golden joined the board of the Obama Foundation. The following year, she was awarded the Audrey Irmas Award for Curatorial Excellence. She is in the throes of leading a major 82,000 square foot building project designed by architect David Adjaye, which is a public-private initiative with the City of New York. We're going to hear more about that. Having hit its original fundraising target of $210 million in October last year, the museum has since established a new target of $250 million. Michael Govan is the Chief Executive Officer and Wallis Annenberg Director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He began his career while majoring in art history and fine arts at Williams College, where he met Thomas Krenz, the then director of the Williams College Museum of Art. As a young graduate student, Michael was recruited by Krenz, and he became the deputy director of the Guggenheim between 1988 and 1994, during a period in time in which the Guggenheim opened in Bilbao, launching the so-called Bilbao effect. From 1994 to 2006, Michael was president and director of the Dia Art Foundation in New York City, conceiving and overseeing the creation of Dia Beacon, which is a 300,000 square foot museum in a former biscuit box factory. He worked closely with living artists to reimagine the displays of their work and has continued his support of land artists like Michael Heiser, recently successfully lobbying Congress to declare as a national monument the 700,000 acre site surrounding Heiser's gargantuan projects in the Southwest. Michael became director of LACMA in 2006. He's been responsible for rethinking the Museum of Everything. He's more than doubled average attendance, navigated expansions and upgrades to the 20-acre campus, overseen the acquisition or gift of more than 56,000 works of art to the museum's permanent collection. And the museum is currently, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the process of constructing a new building for its permanent collection, designed by the architect Peter Zumthor. Meanwhile, Michael has plans to launch at least one satellite campus for the museum, beginning in East LA. Sandra Jackson-Dumont is the director and CEO of the new Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. She has been since January 2020, and she's tasked with overseeing the creation and development of this new museum, including curatorial, educational, public, and operational business for the institution, which is currently under construction on an 11-acre campus in Los Angeles. During her career, Sandra has worked at museums, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Seattle Art Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she was chair of education and public programs since 2014, credited with successfully attracting youngsters and members of communities not traditionally viewed as target visitors by the Met. Melody Hobson, who's the co-founder of the Lucas Museum and the co-CEO and president of Ariel Investments, has said, education is at the core of our mission, so it's fitting that the director of the Lucas Museum be a deeply experienced museum educator. Sandra has more than 2 decades of experience in the field, and we believe she is the leader who will help bring our vision of creating an inspiring and accessible museum to life. So, So a director's vision is necessary, but it is also mediated by board approval, by public and media opinion, by funding, logistics, city governance, COVID, all these different kinds of things. What for you, each of you, has been a non-negotiable about your vision for the building projects that you're all working on? Whoever would like to begin first. I'll begin with Michael because the building project's been going on for longer, so I think I'm going to ask you.
What's non-negotiable? You know, in some way the whole thing is non-negotiable in the sense that if you have a plan and you kind of have to stick through it, especially when, the plan we were working on was a 25-year plan. So you adjust it as you go, but the idea of the project was to really reimagine what a museum of everything could be, and it was programmatically. The building, how it turns out, all of that is all negotiable actually, but the program is not negotiable, like the point of view on what you're setting out to do. So I think that's really important because obviously you have to adjust as times change. So you have to be very flexible at the same time. But I always say, like, as long as you have your arrow pointed in one direction and keep the arrow pointed, a lot of other things will happen as they have happened to change things along the way.
Thelma? That's non-negotiable.
Yes, well, I think in many ways I agree with Michael, right? That what's non-negotiable for me is our mission, right? And by that I mean the singular commitment to the work of Black artists. But in many ways, my answer is also much more practical, because for the Studio Museum, this new building, the bricks and mortar of it are non-negotiable. And that's simply because for 53 years, we've existed in space that was not meant to be a museum. Space that was rented, then bought, renovated, shifted, changed, and we did all of the historic, game-changing work that was done. We're done in these spaces, never built for what we are and what we were. So the non-negotiable is 53 years into our history, our first state-of-the-art, purpose-built, beautiful, fantastic, welcoming, open building for the Harlem community, New York City, and beyond. Thank you.
She drops the mic and then I'm supposed to say something after that. So I'm glad I grew up alongside her professionally. I would say relevance. I agree totally with the two of them, but I think also what's the underbelly of what they're saying is this notion of relevance and binding people to objects and places. And so I think at the Lucas Museum, one of the things that's really important is this notion of narrativity, the stories that connect people. And I would also just say that, I guess, since we're here, if we're talking about people, I'd also like to acknowledge the Lenape people who are the indigenous custodians of this place and this land, past, present, and future. But that truly is, I think, why museums are important overall, but I think particularly at the Lucas.
We've been going through a period where museums have been, as it says in the blurb for this, under fire in lots of different ways. There have been open calls and unionization efforts from staff. There have been lots of media articles about philanthropy, so-called toxic philanthropy. There have been top-level turnaround. And there's been protest, whether that's by artists and activists or members of the public. One of the things that keeps coming up is this idea of care, of museums being in the business of care, that they've seen themselves as being in the business of caring for objects and not so much as caring for people or connecting objects and people. Do you see that as the point of shift in the institutional field in general, and how do you navigate that within your own visions and missions for your institutions?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, Thelma. I would say that's, again, I think that's central to any place of work, first of all. I think caring for its people. I think that this idea that institutions have not done so is radically problematic at best. And I think when you are, people are often positioned taking care of people and objects as completely separate. And I think it's really wonderful to hear institutions talking about connecting people to the objects and also talking about not just that object came from this place, but these are the people that are associated with that place. I don't think that's any different than how we should be treating our staff at our institutions. The level of care that we give for objects is the same level of care. Research, practice around diversity, equity, inclusion, all of these are like very advanced areas of work. Museums really do have to be fully present in those spaces in the way that they do research and have a stellar curatorial practice. I really feel strongly about that. And I don't think I hope that there aren't many directors that would argue with that. I think that we are there now. I don't think it's a shift overall. I think it's a shift as a priority for people saying it. Let me rephrase it. I think that it's more of an accountability shift. It's not a shift in what people have been saying they've been doing. I think that accountability is there now in ways that it wasn't before.
I mean, the reason I passed that question to Sandra is not that I was just ducking it because it's a hard, complex question, but I think at core, this idea of caring for people in institutions has often been relegated to education departments.
Right.
And in institutions, without the right alignment around that, it means that it is a secondary issue to care. But Sandra has always represented, in her work as an educator, bringing that to the forefront, making us know I am someone who's a curator who worked with Sandra as an educator, a museum director who's been a peer, and she has always spoken to the fact that if we don't center that work, if it's not at the center of our institutional lives, then we are not the institutions that have the relevance, the significance, or important. But in terms of shift, I think this moment of shift is one that's very resonant to the moment that the Studio Museum was born. So that in the late 60s, we were born in 68, but all through the late 60s, when artists and staff people in institutions and community members were protesting institutions, demanding of them openness, access, accessibility, some of what came from that were new institutions, and the Studio Museum was one of them. And so I think that when we talk about the shift now, what we're also speaking about is the realization of the many kinds of new ways of thinking about institution and organization in the culture world that happened 50 years ago, now finally being enacted, right, as institutional policy throughout the field, not just as sort of the avant-garde.
I think that's so true. So many people we spoke to for Hope and Dread, I remember one person at a museum saying, it's just that there's so many different kinds of museums, and if you want to be a museum that's a jewel box, safeguarding your beautiful, precious objects, that can exist, but you will increasingly be less relevant, which speaks to your point of relevance. And I guess, Michael, for you, you have such an enormous collection by the standards of smaller museums, not perhaps by the standards of, really, really large sort of encyclopedic museums, but 56,000 objects during your tenure is a lot of work to bring into an institution. How do you navigate discussions of the past with the sustainability of the museum and the relevance of the museum going forwards?
Yeah, I didn't even know there were 56,000. I didn't know that, so it's news to me, but certainly it's a lot of art. Museums are about people. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, one of the things I'm always interested in is that even though we have a museum of all art history, I am an artist-centric person, and I'm always reminding people that they were all made by people, artists. And so somehow I don't even like that idea of like a contemporary art department in a big museum, and tried to change that with our curators to just talk about art and artists. And artists have always made art, and I think it's an easier way to start thinking about people in general. One of the reasons Sandra is director of the Lucas, it doesn't matter that their idea is education, it's because education has been a leading force, your leadership, Sandra, in the field generally. I think a lot of the innovation in museums have come out of education for that reason, that it's connecting people with art. And these idea of shifts, I think it's great. Like museums, art's been around forever. Museums need to keep changing, to keep grappling with how do you connect art and people. And I think, again, for me, that idea that I love an artist-centric museum, even if it's a museum of old art, because it reminds us of that creative process, and it's artists, and that is kind of part of the tool that will help us decolonize that history. It's like the artists have vision, creative force, they are seers, truly, and can collaborate. I don't think of a museum as you put the objects of the artist in the museum, but we've always collaborated with artists in thinking through that question of what can a place of art for people be. And so it's kind of exciting. I think that all the shifts that have been happening, the calls for change, they're correct. There should be change. Again, goes in waves, and I think that it's exciting for us. I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time in museums in that sense, because everything's opening up. It's much more porous.
How much of that do you think is a function of museums existing as a self-determined public space? Even if their funding mechanisms are different, they are public spaces. The title of this is Public Institutions. And if you look at the US, there aren't that many truly public civic spaces, perhaps parks, perhaps monuments in parks and museums. And we see so many of the conversations that are rippling through society, then galvanizing within institutions, within our cultural sector. How crucial is it for democracy that museums can harness those conversations, can hold those conversations, and navigate the shift that that means in authority, that they've gone from that Enlightenment model of being sort of top-down, authorial vessels for communication to hosts, in a way, forums for dialogue?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge, that in your question there's this sweep of history, but, we all steward institutions that are relatively young. LACMA is
65?
Studio Museum 53.
Yesterday.
Right.
Tomorrow, actually.
Exactly.
Up to now.
Right, exactly.
Rooted in the past, though.
But like just in relative terms,
Right.
Our institutions have come of age in this relative late 20th century moment. So for example, this idea of, a museum's role in democracy, well again, my institution was born out of the Black Arts Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, all about the role of culture in the role of democracy. And I think that, I don't think that we can even debate the sort of notion of institutions and their role in the public dialogue. I think the question is we just have to live up to what is expected by that role, right? The idea that we know our institutions live not only as cultural spaces, not only as educational spaces, but critically important civic spaces. And I think that part of where we fit into the civic dialogue is an important way for institutions when we are in the space of not just reimagining, because so much of this conversation is about reimagining the past. I think for many of us, the future thinking is what's so much more critical and important. So I think when we're in that future thinking, future making space, this civic role becomes more profoundly clear and real and relevant.
And how do you bring your boards along with you? And the reason I say that is because the museums have grown enormously. We're all talking about building projects here. The cost of materials has increased exponentially for everybody through COVID. So these are extremely expensive projects that need funding. And we've seen through the last couple decades, since the first major economic crash in 2008, real income inequality. And whilst museums are considered as sort of moral compasses representing democracy, the governance of those museums is really in the handful of a relatively small number of extremely wealthy people who, even with the best intentions, are probably quite distant from the realities of staff inside the institution, of the publics that they represent, or even of even of the day-to-day of communicating that mission, how the staff and the boards communicate with each other and understand what it is, that shared goal of the institution. How do you as directors, in the middle of all of these kind of competing forces and for attention, navigate those power shifts as they move through your institution and kind of corral them towards your vision? Because it doesn't sound like an easy job.
Yeah, I think what you're asking, the answer is in your question, honestly. I really do feel that way. I feel like putting people in extremely close proximity to the actual work is where the shift happens. I think when people are at arm's length from it, it's hard for them to practice a level of sensitivity because they don't know it. I think that when Michael comes along or I get to go with him somewhere, I'm blown away by how intimate the stories are that he tells me about an exhibition or something like. I'm not a board member, but what is interesting, he is my board member. and Thelma is his board member.
Right. I was going to ask you about that.
And so, to me, that actually represents a creative and real significant shift in the field, where you have people that actually are in close proximity to your own practice as a director, sitting on your board, helping other people understand, oh, wait, wow, you saw it that way. This is what's really happening, or this what's really happening in the struggle for understanding. You know, I think that those things make a difference.
That's super interesting, because in some way the role of the director on another director's board is to provide strength in a number, which ordinarily is a number of one. And so advocating for the role of the director is this relatively new thing. How do you navigate that on each other's boards in that way? When is the moment to speak up? When is the moment to sit back and be quietly supportive? When's the moment to commiserate afterwards?
I'm on the board of the High Line. I'm not on a museum board, but I think it's what is most important, which is speak the truth and point to hope. I really do think that that's a significant piece of the work and the job. But you guys are on board, so thank you for all that you do, by the way.
Being an advocate is a good job description sometimes for being a museum director on a museum board. But that's because that's what you should do. And this idea, I mean, there's a reason Thelma's in charge of this project, and her board nicely is letting her take the lead and make the decisions, because she has the experience. She's worked with the artists, she's worked with museums, galleries, and I think, I mean, there's a lot of faith, Thelma, in what you do, properly placed in you, and that probably is the key to the success, because you have all those relationships and you can marshal the forces and you ask advice, and I think it is a critical role that you play. That is the role of the director. That's why you're such a good one.
Thank you. Thank you. And as a board member at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, I think that also being a museum director as a board member, yes, brings definitely certain perspective. But I also think it just speaks to the ways in which, when we talk about boards, they often are seen within the monolith, right, of being about sort of privilege and power. But again, different institutional models. I've inherited an institutional model that always saw a board as being a very sort of key community, and that the representation of what that could mean was about bringing different voices around the table, all tied to mission, to support a director's vision. So really, that's what I think my role is, right? And it's not because I'm a museum director, but part of this larger ecology in which LACMA sits. But I also think that, you know, we all sort of benefit from what it means to be able to have an institutional space of support. You know, and often we talk about it around the financial support, but for me, it really is about the support that manifests in the belief in the institution's possibility, right? And whatever that can mean, whether it's the day-to-day work, right, that just is what we do to open our institutions to audience, or these big transformative projects, building new buildings, creating, you know, whole new lives and whole new realities. It is about board members having the belief, the deep belief, right, in what's possible.
It also, this idea that you collaborate with each other, as, you know, someone who's been reporting on the art world for, you know, too long, it's not totally common. It certainly wasn't. Museums used to be much more competitive. It was very much about securing, you know, the right philanthropic support, the right board support, the right works of art, and we're seeing shift in general in the art ecosystem towards more coalition models and cooperation models. How does that manifest in terms of thinking about sharing? We've heard about sharing expertise and advocacy within each other's realms, but how do you think about sharing collections or thinking of joint projects, that kind of thing?
Generally, I think our institutions have been just too isolated. I've always argued for more collaboration, more permeability between institutions. We're on a mission together, a public mission, and sharing is the key. And I certainly know, like, our collaboration with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences yielded a new movie museum, and we're back and forth with that. We're always sharing. We're sharing collections. We actually have an agreement with the Autry Museum in Los Angeles that our collections are treated as one. They can borrow from us, we can borrow from them, as if they were all in one collection. And I think we need to see much more of that. In isolation, we're much weaker. Together, we're much stronger. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's really true because it's a sparse matrix of cultural institutions across any particular nation. And to really make impact, I do think we have to coordinate and share. And that's happening more and more. I mean, we're just one example of that. I think it's really exciting.
I think the truth of it is, for a long time, museums operated in a competitive space, right? With some sort of weird notion that there could only ever be one of, the best of, in certain ways. And I think that really, when at least my life in this field, you know, almost 4 decades, really existed among a small group of museums, right? The ones that thought of themselves as the biggest, most important, the richest, this competition. You know, I age myself when, you know, comparisons come in my head that, you know, my mother would have said, but she would have said that's like a Macy's Gimbals thing, right? So no one in this room is old enough to remember Gimbals, but if you do, you know, right, what that means. But I think that, you know, again, I lead an institution that always had a model and lived within a community of institutions that understood always our strength to be in collaboration. Now, some of that was born out of necessity, right? The idea in this city, right? We see that across the city. Small institutions have always collaborated. We had to. It was the only way to scale all of our institutions is to be collective. But I think what Michael speaks to really has to do with what I think is a fundamental shift in the field, which sees collaboration, but perhaps even more, the stronger way I would say it, partnership, as being a necessity. And it's not the kind of unequal partnership, right? Sandra and I came up in the age where, you know, people only called us to partner when they like needed
They really
something
wanted
for
the
one
list.
day, right? For one day, one moment, one list, and then that was it, right? You wouldn't hear from them again. But the idea of real partnerships where institutions are valued for the different kinds of currency and the different kinds of capital that they have, and that there is equity in that, and those partnerships can create, I believe, for the field, so much more richness and so much more for our audiences. And I think that's where also some of this comes from.
I agree. I also think that, you know, that competitive territorialism has deep ties to colonialism. I mean, it really does.
Supremacy,
and
patriarchy,
and
you know,
all of it,
all the things.
And I think when you are less interested in that and you realize that you don't have all the goods, whether they're skills, lists, collections, assets, you start doing asset mapping and you come to a space of truth where you realize, wow, if I look at the various assets, you know, time, talent, and money around the places in which I work, then I should actually be thinking from a more collective impact model, where and that also binds you to other people. And so when you succeed, you all succeed. And when you fail, you all go down with each other. I think there's a different, you know, not that I want anyone to go down, but, you know, it's just, there's a way to think about how we rise and fall as a community. And I think that there's a problem when you aren't thinking about things that way. And when something happens, no one's going to stand with you, truly.
It's really interesting to think about that and how it plays out with data. So with LACMA, which has taken part in our data reports that we've ran for several years, you can see in Los Angeles, there's a kind of coalition of thought. There's the numbers of those institutions were all generally higher than the national average, whether they were a contemporary museum like LA MoCA or the Hammer, or Michael's museum. And you would see that that was different actually in New York, that there wasn't that same consensus of thought. There were certain institutions leading and others falling behind, which brings me on to this idea of data. And what I want to ask you about here is data and audiences. I was talking to someone in a museum yesterday who said, oh, we gather so much more data than we'll ever tell you journalists. And you know, we know everything. We know like what people are coming in for, we know about our audiences, we know about things at time of day, how much people are watching, how long they watch for. So for you as an institutional leader, how critical has data mapping become to understanding your audience, first of all, and then we can move that question on to other assets within that, like your collection, your staffing, all of those other realms in which data can shed light in new ways?
I would say that data is super important when it comes to audiences. I also have to say, there's never been a time in my career where being a programmer, a producer, an educator has been more attractive. I could say, whenever I would say that, people are like, oh, kind of like you play with kids. And now it's like the center of all these conversations, which is fascinating, that everyone wanted to highlight my curatorial work. Oh, you work with this artist, you work with that artist. I think right now, I think that information that was so central to us making decisions about what we presented from a programming point of view has become extremely central to decision making in museums. It's almost in the ways that development departments have historically used data in such an amazing way. That's bled throughout every organization. I think data is king, because you know what you know. And you only can get data in a few different ways. One, by talking with people, or two, by following them.
It goes with the accountability. It goes with the increased accountability.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to be accountable, how do you measure your accountability? What's that's part of that? So it's an evolving, and actually education departments were the first to really start to use that drive to see who's coming to the museum, what are they thinking, what can we do to serve our public better, right? Now that's filtered to the whole organization.
Yeah.
I think that what's perhaps most, yes, data, deeply important, deeply informative, not just to understand what you've done, but perhaps what you'll do. But I think that really where maybe the opportunity is in thinking of more innovative ways to use the data that we have. You know, I think we've been collecting from certain relatively important but known possibilities, right? We want to know why people come, who they are, what brought them there, how they found out, what they might come see in the future. But I think being able to open out the way in which we analyze the data is going to, again, offer more of a sense in our institutions of who we serve and how we could serve them better.
How do you see that happening? Do we know yet how that's going to play out, these different ways of using data within institutions?
I think it's being thought through now. I think that's why, you know, maybe some of the people don't want to offer it all fully, because I do think the collection in and of itself in this past, you know, I would say minus the last 2 years, but the past 5 years has been radically different than say it was before that point. So I think there's a lot of possibility there.
I think also a question that I think, or I think a really important point is what people will do with the data.
That's right.
Like, will you listen to it?
Right.
Versus, because there's a lot of that data that's been compiled over years, and, you know, people tell institutions, you know, I mean, this is the truth, this is what people said, this is what we found out, and people are like, that can't be true. I've stood in rooms, like, that can't be true. I'm just like, we just told you, you know, yes, it is true. So how will you use it, and do you have the skills and competencies to use the data in an effective way?
I think that's really interesting, and that's also was our experience with our data reports. People saying, well, it must be wrong, and your data's wrong. We would say, well, it's your data that you gave us. But it's interesting to think about different ways of analyzing that. And the data of your audience is one thing, but the other thing that goes hand in hand with the growth of the institutions is the growth of audiences. There's been a success metric for a long time around attendance figures. And so I was wondering how you separate what the audience wants with the social media aspects of that. Another person in an institution was saying to me yesterday, it used to be the job of comms people to push out information about exhibitions. Now you have like crisis comms that have to think about the branding of the institution in this totally different way. So how do you deal with the pushing forward an agenda that you're growing as you understand your audience better, as that audience grows, with the sort of reactive aspects of crisis communication and trying not to get things wrong or dealing with those aspects, because they seem to be on different timescales. Michael?
I think that, you know, audiences are important. The quality of the audience is important. Who comes, from where, what their experience is. All of that is really important. I think that I think that we're seeing the larger picture. We're in the trust business in museums, right? Like I think the best thing is if we can create a relationship of trust with our audience. We're going to have the greatest potential to serve up new ideas. So if we're going to, again, change the way people look at history in a more inclusive way, in order to do that, it isn't to do an audience survey of what they want to see. The joke is they want to see King Tut's Impressionist collection. The idea is to build a general trust. Social media is good because the point isn't to put out your social media. The point is to create occasions for people to talk to people, right? Because they're more trustworthy than the institutional voice. But I think this idea of trust building is so critical to then opening up people's tastes and interests. And I think so we spend a lot of time thinking about that. How can we make the experience, how can we be trusted? How can we create situations so people will talk to each other about their own experiences there, so that, again, then we can have a larger offering of art, a more inclusive, wider range, and people will be just as happy as in the old days. They just came for 2 shows, and you would see your attendance spike, and then it would come down again if it was that particular content. So that's kind of the goal right now, I think. And social media is actually, for all of its problems, that all we have to listen to and hear, it is the two-way communication mechanism. We hear back, and also it's a way for people to talk to other people. And it does create some accountability, additional accountability, but that idea of also allowing us to build that trust.
And how do you, if you think about what audiences want, there's, how do you think about, you're all building bricks and mortar institutions right now, and the world is increasingly digital. How do you, bricks and mortar institutions, think about, digital viewings, NFTs, like where the future, not of art making necessarily is going, although that's connected, but where the future of kind of culture with a capital C is taking audiences that have been newly attracted to institutions. How do you navigate that digital future?
Well, I think we acknowledge that whether we call it a digital future or a digital first strategy, that I think we all in different ways are leading institutions that will move themselves into the future with that at their center. At the Studio Museum, we've been closed for 5 years, right? So when we closed, pre-pandemic, we already were thinking about how do you create an experience of a place that does not exist in that place, because of course we're building our building on the site of our old building, right? So the Studio Museum closed, we demolished the former building, and now as of 2 weeks ago, steel is coming up out of the ground. So a new studio museum is being built, but acknowledging that process and knowing there wouldn't be a museum, one thing that was clear was thinking about how to work outside of the institution. And in some physical ways, or in Harlem program, doing public work, public artworks in the parks in Harlem, having a traveling exhibition of our collection, all traditional strategies. Also, another strategy for us, which goes to your earlier question, is our partnership with the Museum of Modern Art. And existing within the space of another institution, presenting exhibitions at MoMA and MoMA PS1, thinking about our audiences having access to us in a different space, but also meeting new audiences, right, in this moment. And so I think that thinking of a digital strategy really is just an extension of that. Imagining that when we open our doors on 125th Street, that we are also opening ourselves in a digital strategy to a whole world, and thinking about those experiences uniquely, so that they not only, to your point, encompass what our institutional mission and message is, but also cites us in being an institution that is continuing to exist within thinking about culture, right? For us, culture with, both the big and the small C, right? Black culture at the center of that, but culture broadly.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking, like, the building isn't the institution.
Right.
I think that's the big piece of this.
Yeah.
It's one place where the institution is manifested, and so that can be digitally, that can be everywhere. I learned about the Studio Museum on public television in San Francisco, where I grew up. So the vision and mission of these institutions, that's the institution. And that can permeate anywhere. I think we keep finding ourselves in these places of dichotomy. Somehow we fear that if we embrace social media or participate in these other spaces, that somehow we will get overtaken. The original object has shown itself on so many levels over and over and over again. I worked at the Whitney when we had the American Century exhibition. And I remember walking through the show, and there were all these consultants that were there with Andy Grove, and we were talking about how do we put all this stuff online. And I remember Curtis Wong, who's this great guru in the tech industry, said to us, don't worry about the original object being kind of like dissipated. He said people still want to touch the clothing in the shopping. And this is before online shopping. It was like everything is going to go away. I mean, we're much more closer to that idea now, but every store is going to go away. People, you walk in front of a work of art, I mean, all of us know that the brush stroke, everything about it is just so incredible. So I think in this new era, the notion of an institution, we spent the last 2 years that I've been at the Lucas Museum getting people to talk less about this incredible building we're building and this incredible 11-acre park. Everyone's so infatuated with that. We've tried to move them to talking about narrative art and the institution itself and the mission and vision behind it versus just the building. So I don't feel like brick and mortar are like, I mean, it's just it's another place.
Well, we still want our new building.
Oh no, we want our new building too. No, don't get me wrong. The building is the building.
Okay.
Actually,
But I'm saying we can't trade in.
both are true because the pandemics taught us that we do, the digital reach is amazing, right? The number of people, the idea that we can present our institution is not just a building, but all of these ideas and connections among people and education and all of that. That said, there's the other side, which is the physical world, and I think it's good news for museums, this push to the digital and the metaverse, because when you think about it, the metaverse is going to be awesome, right? Especially for the next generations. And if you're going to do things in real life, it has to be equally awesome, which puts museums in a pretty good place, because we're generally awesome. And if we build new, and that's why the new building, David's building, why the park and grounds, why I think we are investing, and it's a good thing because we will be amazing and real competition, I think, for the digital, because people will need to still have learning space, social space, spaces to be inspired when they're off their computer for a while.
Yeah.
So it's good news.
This also brings me nicely back to the idea of vision. We've been discussing a lot of practical things, especially through the pandemic. Things have been very practically oriented. You're dealing with nuts and bolts of these construction projects. But I wondered, what are the ideas you've had that, people have said to you, nice idea, never going to happen, that you still think within your institution will happen? And this comes from something Michael said to me yesterday on the phone. I think it was about the satellite campuses. And the idea of taking an institution sort of essentially down the road. People said, well, that's a nice idea, but it's never going to happen. And you're like, well, I think it will. So what are the things for you that people thought weren't possible that you totally believe in still? And we'll start with Michael, because you have a bit more runway into it. And you can tell us perhaps about the satellites.
Well, yeah, I think that's the idea of having a goal, having some ambition for change and for serving the public in a new way, like you're building, Thelma. And you're building in park. So, but you do get a lot of that. I remember, in LA, the idea that you're going to tear down the whole thing and start from scratch on a 20-acre campus and build all that, there's a lot of skepticism to that. There's a lot of skepticism now to this idea that maybe that's something, but that should be not over, but that should be bounded, because our future growth, museums always grow, we've seen that, should not necessarily be in that place. So we're talking about making investments in South LA, East LA, North LA, and changing that civic model of a museum as not being a single place, but making investments in those other communities where we already have a lot of programs. Partnerships in some cases, like East Los Angeles College, if they have a museum, we can share art, but there's so many places where a museum is not part of the life that you have. And we do know it's beneficial to life and to education, so if we can extend that. But I think, that's just conservatism in general, that people just, museums have this, there's this idea that they've always been there. Certainly certain museums are built to look like that, the Greco-Roman temple facade, like you've always been there, but I would say it's like, it's still a new thing relative to the history of art, and we have to keep changing. And so I just think there's a little bit of skepticism that, and actually a lot of people think it shouldn't change. That's the crazy thing.
That's it.
Yeah.
That, there's an idea of a museum and it has boxes in it and it's divided up in a certain way. Like, why? There's so many ways to look at the world.
What are your nice ideas to that people have said to you, that's a nice idea, it's not going to happen, that you see as being part of either your vision or the future within institutions?
Well, look, I mean, what idea has there been that people have said it's not going to happen? They haven't said it that way, right? Mm-hmm. But we, live within a cultural structure that has created itself to make that seem like the answer. So, I mean, I carry that both in terms of my institutional mission, right? When a group of people in '68 said, we need a museum for Black artists, many, many people did not believe that that was necessary, and they pushed forward, right, to create something not only that they knew was necessary, but they knew was going to be the agent of change in so many ways. And so in some ways, the institutional legacy that, I'm privileged to lead is all about that. And that's what, in many ways, is the motivation towards each and every action, right, that we've made. It is to make those actions in the absence of validation or a path, right, that says it as possible. So that at the time of thinking about this building project, the building we lived in was a 1914 building. It had been lovingly and beautifully renovated for us by the architect Max Bond, investments by the city of New York for 20 years to keep it up. And there were many people who felt like, well, that's great, that should be it, and said that to me. Thelma, this is fantastic. And that sense of limit, right, to me, is exactly the reason why, of course, the Studio Museum in Harlem deserves a building, right? The bricks and mortar of it, but also to represent the institution which already was existing with the sense of excellence and possibility that did not exist in our spaces. So I think both on a personal level and a professional level, this question of permission is one that I think that for many of us, doing work that is about creating new futures can't be the way into how we step into our purpose.
I would say it's tied to what both of them are saying. I was at a talk with Arthur Jaffa the other day, and he said, someone asked him something like, why do you think people are there's so many issues with Black people? This is an audience member that asked him this, and he said, because they know we're from the future. And I was like, yes, exactly. Right. And he was talking about it in the context of struggle, And so for me, I think the thing that you could ask me this question 15 years ago, and you probably could have asked Lowry this question 20 years ago, and you probably could have asked all these other people the same question. And for me, it would likely have been the same, which is that I think that when I say these places can look different, that they can look like me, and that they can look younger, they can look older, and like white women with white hair can sit next to any other person, like a young Black person, or that these museums can be dynamic and not sleepy, and you can be loud in them, and you can have them reflect society, and they can be of the moment while having historical work in them. I think I get told all the time, oh, well, they're not going to come. And the reality is that they are coming. We are here. Like the notion that we are actually here, and I'm with AJ. They know because we have seen the future, and it's now, right? That's the thing. I think it's fascinating. I'm constantly told no. But right now at the Lucas Museum, what's fascinating is that I have a board that's like, go faster there. Get there immediately. Why aren't you there? Like, it's, right? It's like an interesting thing. And so I'm like, oh, wow, I never thought that I'd appreciate that little tiny bit of corporatism, right? That faster, but attention to the mission. And so for me, it's the same answer over and over again. There are not enough people of color in the field. You don't exist. There are no more Thelmas. I mean, that's true, but there are no more, you know what I'm saying? And so that is the thing that gets said over and over.
Right. Well, it's the limits. It's the limit to
Yeah.
imagination. And it's so interesting in a field that is powered by brilliance and creativity that it is so limited in its thinking. You know, I think we have to acknowledge, we're sitting in the Morgan Library, and many of us, right, have lived in the inspiration of knowing of Belle DaCosta Green, right? And understanding that we, had an ancestor who existed in these spaces before. So I think that really the question of these limits is about the reimagining space. I mean, Sandra's creating a new institution. And it's not just new because it's being newly built, but it's new because of the way in which it's being formed. You know, when I speak to the elders around the Studio Museum, that's what they knew they were doing. They weren't looking just to copy, right, and replicate. They were saying, how do we create something that exists within the context that we are from? And that group of Studio Museum founders was a multicultural group of people, uptown, downtown, artists, civic leaders, so a diverse group, but a group who at that time were sort of opening up the idea of what could be a new way of imagining museums. So again, those lessons of our past, I think, are always, the messages that they were giving us for our future.
Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. Who are the people that you think about? Is it in America when you think of futures of museums? Do you look at other countries? Do you look at other continents, other cities in America, younger generation, elsewhere within the same space, down the street? Museums are in and of the world, so it's a silly question in some ways, but where are you looking for the next generation, for the future vision of institutions? Where do you find really exciting that you hear about or visit?
Well, I find very exciting the idea that, while we might bemoan the way the concept of curating has been completely and totally co-opted, to mean everything, including, how you might pick your dinner off of a menu, right, in a restaurant. Let's put that aside for a moment. But I am incredibly inspired by the self-created acts of curating, archiving, and presenting that are happening by young people, primarily young people of color, queer people, young trans people, and they're doing it on social, right? Meaning they are envisioning, right, this sort of space of the kinds of activities that our bricks and mortar institution do in self-directed ways. And I find it not just inspiring, but an example that I know my own institution has to acknowledge in its sense of itself.
That's so interesting. There's something an artist recently spoke to us about in Leaving Hong Kong, this idea of documenting and archiving as a future conversation, with art always being in conversation with the future, and artists especially so.
Yeah.
For you two, where do you look for inspiration? Is it even in the art world?
I'm an archive geek, and so that for me is one of the really imperative places, because I feel like in many cases there's nothing under the sun that's new, but I also feel that there are some things that when I go to the archive, I know this thing happened. I know Nina Simone performed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1968. I'm one of maybe 4 or 5 people that know that because I found a card in an archive. And I went and I dug through all of the archives to try and find the audio for it. And they weren't recording, they were recording lectures, not necessarily the performances at that time. Do you know what I could have done as a performing art? Oh man, right? But so for me, I think the archive, I also think that, what's happening outside, when I used to teach high school, my classes used to be completely shaped by the conversations that I heard young people having in the hallway that we weren't supposed to hear. That is interesting to me, hearing what's happening out in the world. And so I'm compelled by what's in every day as to shape us. And I think that Thelma's right, young people, but I think it's any young people.
Yeah, there's just so much access to information and ideas now, it's hard to keep up with. I think it's also good to, personally, I love looking at regional museums and places outside the big cities. One of my hobbies is I fly my little airplane across the country and I stop in little museums that no one's ever seen. And I think for a big city museum director, I probably have visited more museums around the United States. And it's amazing, not just art museums, one of the best musical instrument museums in the country is in Vermilion, South Dakota, I think, and it's fantastic, called The Shrine. And I always take so much pleasure in seeing somehow in regional museums where there isn't the pressure to conform, there are so many great ideas lurking really everywhere.
Well, I think, thank you so much for your time and answering my questions. I'm going to open it up to our guests, our audience now.
Thank you, everybody. That was really illuminating to see the chapels of the sacred institutions that we visit on a continual basis, illuminated from the inside out. This is not like a question, but more like a contribution, or maybe letting the elephant out of into the room. But anybody that went to the Whitney Biennial the last couple days has noticed that there's employees on the verge of striking, and they're not exactly striking, but they're waiting for their contracts to be signed. The labor union is sort of dragging its heels to sign a new contract. This goes back to, Charlotte, your opening, saying like museums as sites of sort of social conflict. I mean, it's the MoMA, for one, has been plagued this whole past 2 years with several different catastrophes, protests, on-site sit-ins, and recently the stabbing. I visited a good friend who works there in the senior leadership there, and she was saying that this kind of, you think, especially from an art world insider, that it's all about the cult of the curators or the directors and these kind of grandiose visions. But in fact, she was saying that 65% of the people that go to the museum don't really give a shit of what's on the walls. They're just going there to be at the museum, to have that experience. So it's more about user experience. It's about how clean the bathrooms are. It's about the cafe and the service at the cafe. It's about finding that particular piece you want to, and how helpful the security guard or whoever the workers at the bottom level. So I just wanted to sort of introduce those kind of aspects of sort of the conflicts in terms of disparity in a.
So the question's focusing on this idea of the kind of increasing movement towards labor organization that we're seeing in museums. Is that the question?
Yeah, just maybe you guys could speak to that in terms of,
and how you're navigating that in your institutions, because that's something that we're seeing more and more of, is this open calls by staff, unionization by staff, shifting from being sort of worker specific, within like art handler union or security union, to, museum employee union. Is that, that's obviously a big conversation that's happening internally in institutions. How do you see that playing out within the institutions? How are you broaching that and navigating that as a management issue right now?
Mm-hmm. I think we're meeting it with great care and with a lot of grace, but I think that the comment really speaks to what I'm saying. We are in a fundamental shift. And what all of this, whether we describe it as conflict or simply if we understand it as this sort of fundamental way in which the field needs to change, I think we are in a period where we are going to see that happen. And again, it is not the first time. I came into this field, in the early 80s. And at that point, starting with my, early career as an intern, first in high school programs at the Met, then as a college intern into working in museums in the late 80s, that was also another moment of a shift. That was the shift moment that brought many people like me into the field. I think what we see now is the need for us to examine the entire structure, right? It's not answered by dealing with one or another of these confrontations. It's about really rethinking, how do we make these structures ones that are responsive to the world we live in now, which include the people who work in the institutions, the people who come to the institutions, and how do we reform them? And I think that there's very important work being done in this regard, and we are going to see the result of it, not just in newly created institutional structures, but in institutional structures that we all know well that are going to be somewhat unfamiliar, right? In 10 years, I believe.
That's really interesting. Thank you for your question.
Hi. Farah Nayeri, I write on arts for the New York Times in London. And I don't mean to be shamelessly plugging a book, but I just brought out a book that's all about the shifts. So, parenthesis closed. It's called Takedown. But the question I wanted to ask you, which I came across in reporting on this, writing this book, there are these hashtags on Instagram, and there's one called Change the Museum. And I just wondered, you know, of course they are anonymous, and they come up with complaints that do seem to be genuine for the most part, as far as I can tell. I just wondered how you guys navigate these sorts of channels, these anonymous people going on there and complaining not about your museums, but about other museums and naming them, or et cetera. I mean, how does that factor in?
I mean, I think it's part of the same thing, right? There is a call for accountability, and more visibility of everything, whether it's the bathrooms or institutional racism, right? Like that, there's something actually very, very positive about this, looking at the whole thing, because there's meaning in the whole thing. And if you walk in the door and just go look at a painting and come back out or something like that, you're missing that the institutions themselves are worldviews, how they're structured, how they behave. And so, I mean, there is call for change. It comes in waves in history, but I'm on the side of change in that sense, because we really do need to examine these structures that are held up. What's interesting is a lot of these questions are in the whole world, not just museums, but there's a lot of focus on museums, partly because we value them, right? They're the bastions of culture. They're supposed to mirror and represent our culture. So the good news is people care. And I think the good news is that they're calling for us to all be more aware of everything, which is exactly what we should be doing.
But so on balance, would you say social media is a force for good? If you do two columns, the pros and the cons, would you say that it's a force for good?
That one to Sandra.
I think anything can be a force for good and a force for evil, honestly. I mean, that's been proven time and time again. I think we are not an open institution, but we still have staff. And so for me, one of the things that's really important is to take something like Change the Museum and open a conversation at your institution about it within the appropriate spaces. For us, I can say that in ways that these folks, they're open. It's a different conversation. So for us, we can ask people, what are your thoughts about this? What is your perspective on this? What are the issues and concerns that you might see popping up here? I think I'm much more interested in why the platform, like what isn't happening to address those concerns that needs to be addressed, that people find themselves using spaces like social media. Dream Hampton once talked about people using social media as a space of therapy, right? So great writer, great film, great all kinds of stuff. And she talked about that in relationship to Usher and Rihanna, like a decade ago, you know? And so like today, I'm much more interested in what our institutions need to be well prepared to address from just a staff point of view through not HR, but through anyone who manages people, anyone who works with people. So everyone should be equipped to have these conversations. Museums haven't necessarily always been those places where people have all the skills necessarily to do that kind of work. I think, so I'm not willing to say it's, for good. I think, I'm on record saying I don't believe in safe spaces. People talk about museums as safe spaces. I think they are safer. They're safer spaces. And so I think that that's something to really, I love how the art world loves the pendulum swing. It literally, we love it, either this or that. This whole conversation about DEAI and DEAIB now belonging has been on the cover of AAM probably like 3 or 4 times. I think I have 3 issues. I don't think I was alive when one of them was printed. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, this should have been solved a long time ago. I appreciate your question, though, because it speaks to us needing to look at some root causes and some root issues.
Can I? Yes? Okay. Thank you all. It's such a privilege to see three such remarkable thinkers and directors of museums. But I had a question, and I know you all are facing this similar problem. You all are making large statement architectural structures for your museum, and you all are rightly saying that it's not the building, it's what goes on in the building. So I have two questions. One is about the perennial issue of museum admission and the general public, and how you all think about allocating funds when it could be great if museums could just be accessible for people. I mean, if you're a family of four, you have to spend $100 to walk into MoMA. That's kind of crazy. And the second question, Michael, you tapped into, which I'm very interested in, and you all in a way tapped into this, is how, as thinking of the future, do you tap into regional spaces? Like during the pandemic, we all became aware of kind of non-urban centers and how much we all want to go there. And there's a big movement, and there's a richness of small, nimble institutions, as you pointed out, that could really do a lot in conjunction with you. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll speak to admission. You know, the Studio Museum is part of the Cultural Institutions Group here in New York City, which means we receive funding from the city. In exchange for that, commit to suggested admission. And so up until we closed, we had a suggested admission. And really always saw that as the real opportunity to provide as much access as possible. Now, as we walk towards our new building, we are thinking deeply about this issue of access. Understanding, however, and you know, again, my colleagues were all saying it's not about the building. For me, it is about the building, right? Because this building is growing on 125th Street, right? The capital of what many of us arguably think of as, you know, the sort of soul of Black culture. And this building represents, you know, an act that happened that was cultural and political, and the building being there a block east of the Apollo, you know, 2 blocks west of the National Black Theater, in the neighborhood where also the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Dance Theater of Harlem, and so on are, is really also about what these buildings mean to the understanding of not just a people, but of a representation of our history and our legacy and our humanity. But in that building, the hope is, you know, I am thinking of the many important radical ways that we can open up this conversation about admission. Now, that I'm taking into account that when we talk about institutions, so much of what's at the base of it is how we support these institutions. And, you know, for me, thinking about a future for an institution like the Studio Museum is about thinking about fiscal sustainability. Too many institutions and organizations that were born at the time the Studio Museum was out of that moment don't exist anymore. And that's because they were not supported in ways that they should have been. And so thinking about creating more access to admission really is just, for me, about thinking about other ways to sustain the institutional structure. Right? To make sure that we can have an institutional structure, but to do so in a way that opens the museum to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I do believe in the building.
I know you believe. I know you believe in the building,
especially that building.
I know you believe in the building, but I just have to, you know, say that as you know.
I almost felt like I had to go on record.
No, I know you believe in the building.
I think I have a small piece of like carpet in my apartment from the Studio Museum.
You do.
But anyway, I'll just say, I think one of the things that I think is important for us at the Lucas Museum, being where we are, it's in a park, poor neighborhood in South LA. It's next to USC. It's joining a campus of really awesome institutions, and so this notion of collaboration and partnership is literally at the core of who we are as an organization. We're bringing 11 acres of green space, which used to be 11 acres of a parking lot with white lines on asphalt. All of that went underground setting forth more new green space above ground. The building itself is a canopy, which actually is designed originally after one of the trees that is in that area. And so Los Angeles has a shade issue. I learned that moving to Los Angeles. I had no idea. You could talk to me about all kinds of stuff, and I'm like, give me the sun, and then people are like, hold on 1 second. I mean, there's, right? I mean, I'm talking to my LA folks here, like literally it's a major crisis in this city. The entire belly of this institution rises up to create one of the largest canopies for shade in that area. It is, excuse me, is it going to be free? I love that kind of talking back, by the way. I'm working on that.
That's right.
How about that? I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm still doing cost-benefit analysis, but it, you know, it will. Yes, we will come back to you. Come and snag me as I'm walking out. But I think that that's like a really important piece of the pie. Also, I believe that people should have awesome things where they live. That's what I love about the Studio Museum. You know, people, it's almost like you have to go somewhere else to get great stuff sometimes. And in this particular case, we're bringing even just a little bit more greatness to this particular neighborhood, so people feel like they can actually just mill about in this area in a critical way. So will it be free? Come back to me in like 7 months.
There's also a way to split the difference. Like, I'm not somebody who, free admission maybe would be great, but there's a way to split the difference. The family of four question, that, yeah, like it's expensive for a family. So I don't believe in totally free admission, because when we had 600,000 people, I was able to use some of the admissions money to build a larger program. So now we have 1.2 million people and 600,000 come for free. So growth created as many people coming for free, because about half our audience is free. That's because we have a program where if you're under 17, you join the museum and you can go yourself for free and bring an adult for free. So the family of four actually is free. But the tourist pays because you've paid for your hotel and gasoline and other things. And so there's this idea that we shouldn't throw all that revenue out, because in tough times, like when the economy struggled and donors were having trouble making their payments, if they did, the admissions were coming in. So that kind of diversified revenue stream helped. So I think, you know, our goal is like half free, and free to the people who need it free would be the goal. And buildings, by the way, are key to that accessibility, because it's not just free admission that will bring somebody to a museum. People can say, well, if it's free, everybody will come. That's not true.
That's not true.
That's not true at all. There are a lot of free museums people don't go to. So this notion of accessibility and free, you have to separate them and look at them in different ways. Accessibility has a lot to do with how approachable the museum is. A lot of people don't even know what to wear to a museum. Like how visible are the people in the museum? That's why we made glass walls, so you can see people in the museum. And how accessible is the experience? So buildings are key for that. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to tear down the old buildings was not just because it wasn't earthquake safe, and we live in earthquake land and we needed to protect people in art, but also there was a 90-foot tall wall right on the street versus having a space where people can wander in and take a look-see and sort of feel accessible, and then to have the art more accessible. So they're tied together.
Well, I think...
Lauren.
Oh, we gotta go.
Last question.
Lauren.
Come see all our buildings.
You have one more?
Yes, please.
One more.
I'm sorry, Lauren. Thank you so much for such an inspirational discussion. I'm actually trying to follow the previous question about accessibility and creating a new source of revenue. And I'm wondering if you have any examples or projects of creating new revenues for your institutions, because we know during the pandemic, ticket sales were not here to sustain and support anymore. So I'm just wondering, how do you create new source of revenues for your institutions?
Yeah. We don't have new sources of revenue right now, but inherent in the planning and the strategy for who we will be when we reopen is a radical rethinking of that, right? Because we know that these older sources of revenue, even if we adjust them, right? And, you know, Michael has said, some of what I think is important, though, and what you're hearing here is that there isn't one strategy that works for all of our different kinds of institutions. and the specificity of our institutions, how we understand them in their place around their people, really also is what can determine perhaps how we get to new strategies, moving away from what has been this sort of model that says an earned income strategy is about a store, a restaurant, rentals, and admission, versus what is uniquely possible, right, for an institution where it is to do the work that it would like to do in order to serve its audiences, its staff, its stakeholders, its community in ways that are meaningful and impactful.
Ask Will Smith to watch himself by giving money.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. Let's give a big round of applause for Michael, Sandra, Thelma, and Charlotte. Thank you so much.
Thank you.